can use data followed by action. If you're the development director carrying a portfolio means you're responsible directly for those donor relationships. You find the data out and you look for where the opportunity is. And I think that that's something that you do before you even set your internal goal. And I said it that way because I think there has to be a lot of study and consideration that goes into publicly announcing a campaign goal.
You're listening to The Nonprofit Boost, where Double the Donation and industry leaders share practical tips to help you grow revenue and boost corporate fundraising at your nonprofit. Hi, everyone, and welcome back to the Nonprofit Boost podcast. I'm your host, Immaculate. If you've been following along our podcast, you know we've been talking about capital campaigns, from launching, prospecting, to launching, to doing that hidden behind the scenes work. And so today we're going to build on that conversation by talking about what the team looks like during a capital campaign. And with such a large project and sometimes long project, knowing who does what when is important to the success of your capital campaign. And joining us in this conversation is Gina Vaughn, Vice President of Client Service at Gail Perry Group. Gina Vaughn's leadership and fundraising experience is quite vast, from campaign direction, coaching and training, to growth planning and prospect management, just to name a few. Gina, we're so thrilled to have you on this show.
Well, I'm so thrilled to be here. Thank you for asking me.
Of course. Well, just to dive right into this conversation, Gina, again, you've coached several campaigns. What's the first system of, let's say, role blur you usually notice when you walk into a room of leaders, board leaders, directors, members?
The symptom that we see usually is that the campaign has gotten stuck, or it's stalled, or there's an elongated pause, and there's not a lot of activity happening. And the underlying cause for that can really be a lot of things, but role blur is certainly one of them, and can be really detrimental to campaign success, campaign momentum. When there's a lack of clarity around who's doing what, it tends to demotivate everybody who has a role in the campaign rather than motivate. And that can be for a number of reasons. Fear and insecurity. There are roles that some people are just not comfortable playing. So when you think about a board member, if they think they're going to be put in the position of asking for a donation, they might not be comfortable with that. And so there could be a pause in momentum, or an unwillingness to take action because they're being asked, they think, to do something that they're not prepared to do. The other issue you can see is one around when roles blur, there becomes a bandwidth problem because, in nonprofits, everybody's stretched pretty thin in terms of, the amount of time they have to usually wear multiple hats. And so I think that there is, for very good reason, hesitancy to embark on something that you don't really understand what you're meant to do and why, what your objective is, because you've got such limited scope to begin with. And so, you don't want to start something and have it just be, needless or wasted effort. So I think those are some of the things that we see, and where ownership and understanding ownership with full clarity makes all the difference.
I love that. It sounds like having a lot of conversations beforehand, really making it clear what their goal or their role is, which we will have a question a little bit later on about what that looks like, or how that conversation can go. But now that we kind of talked about, the importance of having a division in the roles, there is also a lot of importance when it comes to partnerships, with campaigns, as I mentioned, being so long and as big as they are, with a lot of moving parts. It seems kind of impossible that you're not going to be interacting with a different team member, with another person, with a different department. And I was reading an article from Gail and Perry, and they mentioned that this specific partnership, the partnership between an executive director and a director of development, is a success predictor. I was just curious, why that is, and how can nonprofit leaders ensure that partnership is there?
Well, I think it's a success predictor because, again, it's a a bandwidth question, right? So you're taking the DOD and the executive director are essentially the two most senior front-facing, prospect-facing positions in any nonprofit organization. And so in order for them to divide and conquer with a level of clarity, there have to be really transparent, almost, I'm going to say, vulnerable conversations between the two of them that define what they think they can do within their bandwidth, and that's especially true for the executive director, and how and why they're expected to do it. So, for instance, you might have, depending on the size of an organization, certainly you might have an executive director who carries a portfolio. They're probably not carrying a big portfolio, but they might be carrying one. And so having a conversation around, well, what does that mean? If you're the development director, carrying a portfolio means you're responsible directly for those donor relationships. If you're the executive director, it might mean you do the donor facing, you have those conversations, you make those phone calls, but it's up to the development director or a member of the development team to prep you for that. So in other words, they have to manage up. But if they haven't had a conversation about who's doing what, you could be leaving your executive director sitting there thinking like, I don't have any even talking points. I don't have the prospect research. How am I supposed to make this phone call? And then guess what? Nothing gets done, going back to the original question. That's why role clarity in those two positions is so, so important. They're the two leadership positions for the campaign, and dividing and conquering requires that you know what you're dividing and who's conquering what.
I love that. Thank you so much for sharing that. Well, I guess to kind of tie this into something that you've already said earlier and is a question that keeps popping up is, getting these board members off the sidelines, getting them from being passive to being like active advocates, but without, again, accidentally putting them in a seat that they're not equipped for, or they didn't understand that they were doing. What are some few things you can share there?
So this whole idea of how you activate a board member in a campaign, it's, a board member role is generally speaking a strategic role. It's an oversight role. They are supposed to sort of have the advice and consent kind of function within an organization when it comes to the mission and how the mission is pursued. It's not necessarily a tactical role. In fact, I wouldn't necessarily advocate for boards that are overly operationally engaged. But in a campaign, provided that you can give your board members, it is up to you as staff to give your board members an idea as to how the strategy that they, as board members, have approved and are championing is brought to life through the campaign. And so they might have a role in bringing it to life. You're defining the tactics. As staff, you define the tactics, though, and that might mean you're bringing the board member in into the role of either an ambassador or maybe a host or a networker. But you don't need to ask them to devise the tactics. There's some pre-work that you can do to figure out where you can deploy certain board members most effectively without asking them to make the tactical decisions. You make the decisions and then ask for their help implementing them. And that can be a bunch of things. You can ask them to do prospect review. You can take, a list of names and say, all right, who on the board knows people on this list, and can you make an introduction? What do you know about their, you can, in the same meeting, what do you know about these individuals' philanthropic habits, if you know anything, right? You can ask them to be ambassadors. The idea here, though, is that whatever you're asking them to do, you communicate at the outset what the strategic objective is, what the tactic is, in other words, what you expect them to do and how they're supposed to do it. And then you resource them, the staff resources the board member to ensure that the job gets done. Because you can't just hand off a relationship and say, okay, run with it. That doesn't ultimately benefit everybody. The coordination wouldn't be there. So now if you've activated your board members, now you have to staff your board members. So it's more work, but it can yield great benefit in the long run.
Nonprofits are always being asked to do more with limited time and resources. Double the Donations virtual summits offer practical insights, expert advice, and actionable ideas to help you grow your impact. Check out the summit calendar and register at doubletheDonation.com/virtual-summits. We'll see you there.
No, I love that. Just to add a little bit on your point about how they could be advocates, there's something that we like to share over here at like Double the Donation is how, again, a board member can play a role in this. And it's to add a little bit onto what you said about like prospecting. We really see a cool way of board members, like, you know, connecting their nonprofit. If this board member works for a company, they could be like, hey, my company is interested, or we have programs where we'd love to donate. And so that's a really great opportunity for them to be a connector there in your nonprofit and the board member. It's just a really quick way to be like, hi, my nonprofit is looking for donations or supporters for this campaign. And so that's a really great conversation to have there. Another thing we like to share, as well. I don't know if you've seen that have you seen that on the ground, Gina? Have you seen that happening?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that is something also that I think staff have to be responsible for facilitating as well, is prompting those kinds of questions, you know, or prompting the board member to take that step. But yeah, that's an incredible way for board members to get involved and also to set an example, because, you know, people like to join a winning team. And if they've seen it work for somebody else, they're more likely to do it themselves.
I love that, because that was actually the next thing I was going to share. It's like how board members can even personally share themselves or donate, I guess you could say, or give, however whatever your campaign needs specifically, because it normalizes that, hey, if the board members can do it, I can do it too. It can be just as easy, it can be just as simple or seamless. And so I love that. I love that point there.
Well, and it makes perfect sense, right? Because if you're a potential philanthropic investor, if you're a potential donor and you are having a conversation about making a significant gift, and maybe you're thinking of this as an investment, and you were to say to the executive director, has your board contributed, or who has contributed? And if you as an executive director can't say, well, 100% of my board is on board, why would anybody else invest in it? Your board should be your biggest fan.
Yeah. I love it. Like it's a little bit of a credibility thing there.
Yes, of course.
Yeah.
Of course.
Okay, I love that. I didn't even think to view it that way. So I love that little point there that you made. Gina, again, we talked a lot about having really important conversations just to make sure everyone knows what they're doing, when to do it. And so another conversation, you know, that comes up is like announcing a goal. How can leadership use information such as data, capacity to feel more confident about setting bigger, bolder goals as a campaign target?
Well, I think you can use data followed by action. So, you know, one of the things that we find a lot of times in client work, and I think you've probably you're pointing to it a little bit indirectly when you talk about, individuals looking for corporate matches, for instance, that they might have access to, or their family might have access to. I mean, you're looking for where the revenue is sort of hiding in your donor pool. And that might be, again, with the access to matching gifts, but it also could be with philanthropic capacity that you just haven't managed to activate yet. So you've got a donor who's giving you a relatively low amount every year consistently. Then you screen them and find out they could be giving you 100 times that. And suddenly it's a whole different conversation. So you find the data out and you look for where the opportunity is. And I think that that's something that you do before you even set your, I'm going to say, internal goal. And I said it that way because I think there has to be a lot of study and consideration that goes into publicly announcing a campaign goal. We talk about in campaigns, we talk about quiet phases and public phases. And of course, honestly, you want your campaign, even during the quiet phase, to basically be the worst kept secret in your, community. But you don't have to go around screaming from the rafters that your goal is $50 million or whatever it might be. Because the one thing you want to know before you start screaming up from the rafters is that you have a very good chance of reaching it. And so, you don't want to go with that public announcement until you're, 60, 70% of the way towards your goal to make sure that you're likely to succeed. And of course, all the things with data and looking for opportunities, that all happened well before this point, when you started the process to begin with. But it's critical. The data is critical.
Is it okay if I ask a little bit follow-up question? It's not
Sure.
part of the lineup, but is it?
Yeah, no, that's fine.
Okay. I was just really curious because we talk about all this data and things like that. How are the leaders of the organizations involved in that? I mean, who's doing the prospecting? Are they making the decisions, or are they finding someone outside of the organization doing that? I'm just really curious on that point.
So when you think about prospecting, you're talking about discovering new prospects. So not people who are within your database already, right? And that is, that's a bit of a marketing function. It's like, sending out appeals and seeing who comes in, and then analyzing who comes in of their own volition, who essentially raises their hand for you, analyzing and looking for greater opportunity. So that's like when you take all the new donors you acquire in a given year and you screen them to figure out where there's capacity and where they might need to move into a gift officer portfolio for more one-to-one attention. And leadership is definitely involved in that, because as you, as a matter of course, I would say, execute that kind of research on the people who raise their hand to give to you, then you've got this whole vetting process that you need to undertake, which is you sit down, your internal team, and sometimes your board members, and you go through this list and you say, who knows who, and how am I going to get that first meeting? I mean, maybe it's going to be a cold call, but maybe one of your board members, used to work with them 10 years ago and still sees them on the golf course, in which case, you've got an open door potentially. So that's where leadership is involved, is thinking through the strategy of engaging the individuals who have some promising affinity and capacity markers.
Thank you so much for that. I love how it kind of looped back to the very beginning of this conversation, which was amazing. We didn't need to do that. So actually, Gina, thank you again so much for sharing all that expertise. Mm-hmm. We are wrapping up the conversation, but of course, we love ending this podcast with some actionable advice. So looking ahead to the next 30 days, what would you tell nonprofits for they can empower their boards, their leadership to drive campaign success? It can be one thing, it can be three things. It's really up to you.
Well, so I do have a couple of things. When we talk about where we started with this concept of role blur or role clarity or lack thereof, one of the things that I think that nonprofits can do is solidify a written board position description that includes those elements of the fundraising program where they either will or may at some point in the future engage. And that means usually that means 100% giving at a level that is meaningful relative to the board member, not just a floor or a ceiling, but just something that's meaningful relative to the board member. But it also probably includes things like acting as a networker and a door opener to help the organization engage donors in its mission. So position description on paper shared with the board members and talked through with them so that in case they have questions, they understand. Because again, the last thing we want to have is, a situation where you've asked your board member to take on a specific role and they are immediately worried because they don't want to ask for money or something like that. That's one thing. I think you could also, and we have done this in some cases with clients, survey the board members to try to get their really candid feedback about who feels good doing which kind of, or performing which role in fundraising. Are you comfortable hosting an event at your home? Great. Are you comfortable sitting in a room with your executive director while the executive director asks for a gift and you're there to share your testimonial about why you give? You're going to find those things out if you just ask. People will tell you almost anything if you just ask them. And then the last thing I will say is prepare yourself in advance. Think through, if you are giving your board a position description, you as a staff, think through what that really means. because you can't just hand them a job and then not support them in doing it. So, who's going to pull the prospect research if a board member is going to open a door for you? Who's going to prepare the talking points? Who's responsible for getting them to the board member and then following up by phone to make sure that everything's clear? All of those things are roles that somebody has to fulfill, but you need to know who the somebody is, because otherwise, again, it just won't happen. So those are 3 things that I would say right out of the gate are things that we can all think about right away.
Yeah, in the next 30 days. And I love your last point. I think you're so focused on one task that you kind of forget that everything is interwoven and connected with each other. So it's really important to think of it as a bigger picture and like a web where things are connected. So I really loved that reminder there. And then, but Gina, in case anyone has any more lingering questions, wants to ask you guys more information, what's the best way for them to reach out to you or to reach out to your team?
Yeah, you are welcome to reach out to us at Gail Perry Group. I'll give you my email address. It's g.vaughn@gailperry.com. We are always happy to hear from nonprofits and hear what's going on in the real world, and try to be a resource when we can. We would love to talk to everybody.
Yeah, no, if you guys have any questions, feel free to reach out to Gina and to Gail Perry Group. And thank you again for joining us on our podcast. See you in next week's episode. Bye, everyone. Here's your next steps. Visit doublethedonation.com to explore the tools and strategies that schools and nonprofits use to unlock more revenue through corporate fundraising. And if you found this video helpful, don't forget to subscribe and share the video with your team and peers.